Thank you very much. And as everyone else did, I'd like to thank Carl and Quentin for inviting me to participate today, and for all of you to lasting till the final paper. For the final talk at our workshop this afternoon, I'd like to shift our attention northward from Crete to the islands of the Aegean, and focus on one particular element of urbanism, the adaptation and implementation of Minoan architectural elements into the built environment. Current discussions of Minoanization tend to place heavy emphasis on the adoption and adaptation of the wide range of imported or non-local artifactual, artistic, administrative, and technological cultural traits throughout the region. Recent research in this area has benefited greatly from the incorporation of theoretical and methodological approaches long advocated by anthropologists working in the French tradition of the chaîne opératoire, with the resulting emphasis on process and performance yielding extremely promising results, particularly in the area of ceramic studies, and providing stimulating new questions that have dramatically transformed the way we both understand and explore the socio-political landscape of the Middle and Late Bronze Age Aegean. In stark contrast, despite the fact that architecture lends itself quite easily to study from myriad perspectives and serves as perhaps one of the best classes of material culture in which archaeologists can seek clues to social identity, the corresponding dissemination of Minoan building traits has received relatively little attention to date beyond the basic identification and enumeration of supposed non-local constructional elements in the landscape. This situation, which is by no means unique to the Aegean, owes largely to the fact that, with the exception of Akrotiri, none of the relevant settlements in the region has received a detailed and systematic analysis of its built environment. As a result, we have neither a firm grasp of the diachronic development and character of each local building tradition, nor an adequate understanding of the larger contemporary architectural landscapes into which these foreign features were incorporated. Compounding the problem, moreover, is the fact that there is still much we do not know about the Cretan and mainland prototypes that served as the inspirations for the formal and functional changes we see in the islands. For example, the composition, organization, and status of the workforces responsible for their execution, the precise social and political function and meaning of the exported architectural elements, and the overall nature and significance of regional stylistic variations evident in the Minoan homeland. Despite these difficulties, however, or perhaps because of them, it seems to me essential to include the built environment in any discussion of Minoanization, as the organizers of this workshop on Minoan architecture and urbanism have afforded me the opportunity to do today. My starting point for this discussion is the site of Aegean on the island of Kea. Since its excavation by John Caskey in the University of Cincinnati from 1960 to 1976, the site of Aegean has served as one of the principal catalysts for investigations into the spread of Minoan culture throughout the Aegean in the later Middle and early Late Bronze Age. Indeed, the abundance, concentration, and range of material, architectural, iconographic, technological, and administrative evidence at the site that was inspired by, adapted, and/or adopted from the Cretan cultural package suggests that it functioned as one of the key nodes in the complex web of exchange networks that facilitated the dissemination of non-local traits across the region throughout this period. Despite the quantity, quality, and variety of such evidence at Aegean, however, only a single structure in the settlement, House A, has been hitherto recognized as betraying any indication of Minoan architectural influence. Currently located in the southeast quadrant of the site, though originally probably closer to its center if changes in sea level are taken into account, House A underwent a series of remodelings over the course of the LM1A through LM2 periods, or periods 6 and 7 in Caskey's local pottery terminology, the end result of which produced an interesting blend of local and Minoanizing features. The latter, though perhaps sometimes overemphasized in the scholarly literature, are evidenced in the eastern reaches of the complex, where the primary social and ritual rooms were apparently housed, and can be seen not only in the inclusion of specific room types and design features, such as the so-called pillar crypt in basement A31, the modified light well with its associated windows in room A23, the switchback staircase with sottoscala in A32, and the pseudo-pier door partition in the south wall of Court 86, but also in the overall approach to organization and planning, with the block-like arrangement of rooms here, marked in green, differing markedly from the tendency towards linear arrangements evidenced in both the western rooms of the house and elsewhere in the settlement, marked in blue. While neither the exact mechanisms by which such foreign elements came to be incorporated into the structure, nor the precise identity of its builders or occupants is certain, House A is almost universally labeled as the residence of the settlement's ruling authority. Caskey, for example, in the foreword to its final publication, described House A as, quote, the largest single building and presumably the most important in the economic life of the community, end quote, and later, quote, the principal building of its time on the site, end quote. Cummer and Schofield, who authored the final publication, referred to it as, quote, a royal residence, or at least the seat of the governing authority, end quote, and a microcosm of the Minoan palaces, while other terms such as administrative center, mansion, and even palace have also been applied to it. Such labels are strengthened by, if not predicated upon, the observation that the rest of the site was dominated by structures of purely local design and construction throughout the entire Minoanizing era. As a result, most discussions of Minoanization at Aegian seem to assume the existence of a single elite faction resident in House A, be it local or Cretan in origin, that was the primary or even sole driving force behind the introduction and incorporation of Minoan cultural elements into the settlement. Such a top-down perspective, however, not only takes for granted the existence of a strict hierarchical system of government, but also runs the risk of overemphasizing the role played by the residents of House A in the socio-political landscape of the settlement, and relegating to the position of passive, almost involuntary observers the other inhabitants of the site. Indeed, current discussions of Minoanization challenge more and more this traditional position and employ instead a distinctly bottom-up approach that explores the active rather than passive nature of the role played by settlements and their constituent inhabitants in the islands and on the Greek mainland in this process. This approach, which emphasizes the deliberate and conscious nature of individual and group participation in the socio-political and economic developments that transpired during the late Middle and early Late Bronze Age, has succeeded in demonstrating that the precise composition of the Minoan cultural package adopted by native communities and the manner in which it was integrated into the local symbolic vocabulary differed significantly in both quantitative and qualitative terms, not only between, but also within those settlements operating within these regional exchange networks. It is against this intellectual background that I'll discuss some of the recent work I've been conducting as co-director of the Aegian Northern Sector Archaeological Project, or INSAP, on the suite of rooms known as the Northeast Bastion, the architectural, material, and iconographic evidence from which has led me to identify it as a Minoan-style banquet hall. I will argue further that the existence of a second distinct establishment of Minoan character, located some distance from House A, not only strengthens the position of Aegian as one of the primary conduits for the reception and transmission of Minoan and Minoanizing cultural traits throughout the Aegean, but also provides further indication that the adoption, adaptation, and integration of such traits served as an important mechanism for the negotiation of status between members of individual communities. And finally, I will make a few observations that might, I hope, on the one hand, serve to illustrate the rather distinctive nature of the processes involved in the transmission of architectural as opposed to artifactual traits, and on the other, to stimulate interest amongst those gathered here in contemplating and/or pursuing this topic further in the future. The Northeast Bastion was excavated over the course of 7 seasons in the 1960s, but despite the richness of its contents and its physical prominence in the architectural landscape of the settlement, it has received little attention in the scholarly literature. In his 1971 preliminary report, for example, Caskey remarked upon its intimate connection with the fortification wall and suggested that the rooms on its upper story housed members of the site's military personnel, though he provided no justification for or further elaboration on his suggestion. More recently, Livia Morgan, who's in the process of completing a monograph on the wall paintings from the Northeast Bastion, has emphasized the elaborate nature of its fresco decoration, the scale of its construction, and its dominating position overlooking the eastern approaches to the settlement, and has suggested that the rooms on its upper story housed elite feasting activities associated with public festivals held in the open space east of the settlement. By and large, however, aside from these brief mentions and the preliminary publication of the fresco fragments by Catherine Abramovitz in 1980, the Northeast Bastion has not figured into any discussions on Minoanization. One of the primary reasons for its omission from scholarly discourse is likely the spectacular nature of the discoveries from other areas of the settlement, notably the rich and well-preserved remains from House A and the striking collection of female figures from the so-called temple. Compounding this situation is the fact that the entire northern extent of the settlement suffered severe damage on several occasions, after its abandonment at the end of the 14th century BC, thus hindering study of its remains. As early as the 4th or 5th century AD, for example, a significant portion of the fortification wall was dismantled and its stones melted down for the production of lime, as is indicated by the presence of a late Roman kiln north of the northeast bastion. More recently, the construction of a roadway in the 1920s or 30s across the northern reaches of the site obliterated almost all traces of ancient occupation in the area, resulting in the removal in some areas of up to 2 meters of fill. Further difficulties arose, moreover, once excavations commenced. The walls to the south of the road cutting, for instance, which in some cases were preserved to well over 2.5 meters in height, had been so damaged by the earthquake that struck the site in the LM1B period that they had to be partially dismantled in order to allow for excavations to proceed. And as work progressed, the high level of the water table meant that only 2 rooms and parts of 2 others could be excavated down to floor level. Despite these difficulties, however, both the overall form and function of the northeast bastion, or at least of its ground floor, seems relatively well established. The northern, eastern, and southern sides of the complex were established by the expansion of the fortification system early in period 6, or LM1A, part of the massive rebuilding program that was undertaken following the widespread destruction that struck the settlement at the end of period 5, or MM3A. Its current western limit is defined by the course of the original line of the period 5 fortification wall, although it's possible that the complex once extended further west into the area destroyed by the old road cutting. A wide corridor, N16, running along the northern side of the building, opened at its eastern end onto a small rectangular chamber, Tower NE. A series of small chases set into the walls of this chamber at roughly the same level as the threshold likely served to support a wooden floor, beneath which was set a small crawl space used for storage. Another doorway at the western end of N16 opened onto a second corridor running to the south, into whose eastern wall were cut 2 further doorways. The northern door, whose threshold was brought to light roughly 20 centimeters below the water table, opened onto a large rectangular chamber, N18, into whose floor were sunk 11 pithoi, suggesting that this room functioned as the primary storage facility for the northeast bastion. The southern door, which does not appear to have been cleared, and which does not always appear on the published plans, opened onto a second, somewhat larger rectangular chamber, into whose southwest corner was constructed a vertical drain that served to evacuate liquids from the upper story to the exterior area to the south. Excavation in N20 was halted before ground level was reached, but given the presence of the storage room to the north and the likely existence of a banquet hall in the upper story, which I shall posit shortly, I suggested this room housed the main kitchen of the establishment. The southern end of the north-south corridor appears to have been occupied by a well-built switchback staircase that served to provide communication between the upper and lower levels of the northeast bastion. One short flight of schist risers rose about 1 meter to a paved landing, from which a second flight of risers in N19 ascended to the upper story. A wide opening in the wall south of the landing is usually described as the main entrance, but the supposed threshold of this door rests roughly 80 centimeters above the landing, rendering such an identification impossible. Instead, I suggested this opening housed the wooden frame and sill for a large window, rough cuttings for which are still discernible in the stones along its west side. Similar combinations of switchback staircases and windows have been noted on Crete, for example in the Royal Villa and South House at Knossos, and at Akrotiri, as for example in the West House. The precise arrangement of the rooms in the upper story cannot be ascertained with absolute certainty, but there are some indications that it mirrored the plan of the basement level. A vertical seam in the western end of the north wall of room N20 may be the remnants of the east jamb of a doorway, while a flattish stone with a worn upper surface, set immediately to its west, could have served as a threshold. It seems probable, therefore, that the space above rooms N18 and N20 was occupied by 2 communicating rooms, a suggestion made also by Morgan on the basis of her identification of 2 distinct types of floor plaster fallen into the basement. A series of vertical chases set into the eastern and southern walls of room 20 likely served to support the wooden substructure of the upper floor, the level of which accords well with the proposed threshold and the top of the drain in the southwest corner of the room, while a number of schist slabs fallen into the basement appear to be the remnants of stone paving. The The most spectacular aspect of the upper story, however, is perhaps the rich decoration with which its walls were adorned. A number of panels bearing images of plants, including bramble and myrtle, decorated the walls of the northern room, while a series of miniature frescoes depicting architectural facades, hunt scenes, richly dressed women, men in procession, and ships adorned the walls of the southern room. Though there's no direct evidence for such a construction, Morgan's suggestion that the eastern and southern walls of the upper story were provided with multiple pier and window partitions is attractive, since not only would such an arrangement provide the room with abundant light and air, it would also afford its occupants a spectacular view of any public gatherings that took place to the east and south. A nice parallel for such an arrangement can be found in the West House at Akrotiri, where the northwest corner of room 5 is provided with pier and window partitions flanked by frescoed panels and surmounted by a miniature frieze. Few of the elements evident in the design and construction of the northeast bastion find parallel elsewhere at Aegean, most notably the use of switchback staircases, the incorporation of multiple long corridors, and the large size of the two eastern rooms in their strict rectilinear design. Switchback staircases do appear in House A, where there are two examples, and probably in the central section of Area N, up here. While the eastern quadrant of House A and two complexes of axially arranged rooms built against the fortification wall in areas G and L do appear somewhat rectilinear in nature. For the most part, however, the overall design of the northeast bastion contrasts quite strongly with the rest of the settlement, where the dominant feature is the linear arrangement of small rectangular or trapezoidal rooms connected by doorways aligned down their center or along their side. I've suggested elsewhere that such room strings stand as the hallmark of the local building tradition at Aegean, where they occur in a variety of settings. Sometimes as independent buildings, as in the case of House F and several smaller structures in areas W and L. Sometimes along the interior face of the fortification wall, as in the example cited above in areas G and L, as well as in area N. And sometimes as subunits of larger complexes, as in the western basements of House A. It seems likely, therefore, that those responsible for the construction of the northeast bastion drew their inspiration from sources that lay beyond the traditional building practices of the island itself. In fact, the best parallels for the formal and functional arrangement of space here would appear to be found in Neo-Palatial Crete, in those suites of rooms bordering the central courts, which Graham labeled banquet halls. At Malia, for instance, above rooms 9.1 and 9.2, Graham reconstructed a columned hall with wide windows that was accessed via a switchback staircase to its east, while to the north, a second stairwell communicated with a series of storage magazines and kitchens further in that direction. Graham identified similar arrangements in the north wings of the palaces of Festos, which you see here, Katozakros, and Knossos, and Souls has argued for an analogous suite of rooms north of the central court at Gornia. It's true that the northeast bastion does not copy in wholesale or mechanical fashion the formal or functional arrangement of space in these Cretan complexes, but neither is it true that any of them are slavish imitations of one another. Instead, as was the case with the spread of palatial architectural elements across Crete and the Aegean in general, it's rather the conception of how the space was to be organized and the social and ritual activities which it was intended to house that were of primary importance. In effect, then, those who commissioned and those who constructed the northeast bastion, and indeed the east wing of House A, made a deliberate and conscious decision not to mimic, but to adopt, adapt, and integrate those specific design features that best suited their purposes, an observation that's also been made by Abramovitz and Morgan with regard to the wall paintings recovered from across the settlement. More important, perhaps, than merely identifying the presence of a second complex at Aegean that incorporates Cretan architectural features, or indeed of enumerating them in list-like fashion, is assessing the significance of such a structure in the socio-political landscape of the settlement. The scale of its design and the elaboration of its decoration leave no doubt that its construction required the expenditure of significant amounts of human and capital resources. And it's tempting, therefore, to associate the northeast bastion with the occupants of House A, for whom it would have served as an additional manifestation of their high status and the control, economic or otherwise, that they exercised over the other inhabitants of the site. The intimate nature of its position with the expanded fortification system, moreover, itself a monumental expression of wealth and power, might then be viewed as further symbol of the prominent position held by this central authority. Such an argument, however, rests upon the assumption, however possible, that there was but a single faction within the community that possessed the desire and/or ability to access and incorporate architectural features derived from Minoan and/or other Aegean building traditions, and to mobilize sufficient resources to organize and implement their construction, or the construction, or rather reconstruction, of the fortification system. Given the fact that we lack direct evidence for the nature of social and political organization not only on Kea, but throughout the Aegean Islands, and even to a large extent on Crete itself, it's entirely possible that the socio-political landscape of Aerini was less hierarchical than currently envisioned, and rather more heterarchical in nature, a landscape populated by a variety of competing and cooperative factions possessed of different levels of desire and ability to participate in this game of Minoanization. According to this approach, some residents of the settlement, such as those responsible for the construction of House A in the northeast Bastion, chose to refashion their physical environment by emulating the latest fashions current among their peers on Minoan Crete. Others, such as the occupants of House J, restricted either by desire or necessity, conformed entirely to local building techniques, but nevertheless opted to decorate their traditional abodes in Minoan fashion. And still others, a significant portion of the local populace, if the quantity of relevant finds is any indication, limited their involvement to the manufacture and trade of products in the new global exchange networks that were rapidly expanding across the region. More problematic for such a scenario at Aerini, perhaps, is the fortification system, the very presence of which would seem, on the surface at least, to support the notion of a single central authority governing the settlement. It should be noted, however, that the original circuit wall was laid not in period 6 or 7, when House A was supposedly the dominant structure on the site, but rather in period 5, when there was no such singular edifice. Moreover, close examination of the construction of the fortification wall reveals that it was not erected as a single unit, but rather was composed of discrete sections built in piecemeal fashion. One explanation for such a phenomenon is that the labor force was composed of various gangs of workmen drawn from throughout the community, each of which was free to follow its own particular method of construction. And while it's true that such a division of labor is not incompatible with the existence of a single driving force behind this building program, neither is it incompatible with a system in which different factions within the community combine their effort in cooperative fashion to achieve the same end. In this light, it's interesting to note that the repairs, and in particular the expansion undertaken to the fortification system in period 6, give the impression less of a wholesale site-wide renovation project conducted under the auspices of a central governing power, and more of a series of smaller independent enhancements implemented by and for, at least directly, more discrete sections of the community. Moving beyond the confines of the island of Kea, Minoanizing architectural elements have been unearthed at a number of settlements across the Aegean. But with the exception of Akrotiri and to some extent Philakopi, none has been published in a full and complete manner. As a result, with an absence of appropriate architectural plans, a paucity of helpful photographs, and a shortage of discussions of the materials associated with these structures, it's difficult, if not impossible, to assess with any degree of detail or certainty the nature and significance of these Minoanized built environments. Nevertheless, given the title of my paper, it would seem inappropriate of me to finish today without at least commenting upon this issue. So if you'll allow me to indulge in some educated speculation, semi-educated, wild speculation, I offer 3 observations that I believe provide one possible framework for beginning to understand the significance of this phenomenon. And I pose 2 questions that I hope might highlight possible directions future research in this area might take. The first observation is that the mere presence of Minoan architectural features in a structure cannot be taken as an indication that it housed the central authority of a settlement. Multiple such structures have come to light at Akrotiri, Trianda, and if you accept the argument put forth here, Aerini. And while single structures have come to light at Miletus, Iassos, and Kos, it's important to remember that only small sections of the relevant levels of these sites have yet been exposed. The second observation is that while some of these structures were provided with elaborate exterior facades, notably the zesty buildings at Akrotiri and perhaps Building F at Iassos, the focus of much of the Minoanizing architectural activity was more often the interior of the building. Moreover, while the specific combination of imported design elements varied from structure to structure, the overall result of their juxtaposition appears often to have been the creation of formal spaces that mimicked the spatial configuration found in the banquet halls and/or Minoan hall systems of Neopalatial Crete. I've already cited two such examples at Irene and Hausae in the northeast Bastion. At Akrotiri, similar combinations of large fresco-adorned rooms, piran-door partitions, and switchback staircases can be found, for instance, in the West House, Building Delta, and Zesty 3 and 4. An analogous combination of Minoanizing elements is also found at Philakopi, where Atkinson's excavations in the early years of the last century brought to light a suite of basement rooms that included two storerooms in the form of pillar crypts, flanking a possible switchback staircase. The presence of a few gamma-shaped pier bases and numerous fragments of painted plaster amongst the debris fallen into and around these rooms suggests the existence of a frescoed parlor provided with pier and door partitions on the upper story, similar to those at Akrotiri and Irene. And though the larger architectural context into which they were set is missing in most cases, at least 4 additional pier and door partitions have been identified in Kos and Rhodes. My third observation is that unlike the Minoanization of local pottery traditions, which appear to have been rather lengthy processes that underwent intensification, expansion, and elaboration over the course of several centuries, the era of the Minoanized architectural landscape in the Aegean seems to have been of a much more limited duration. In fact, aside from 2 possible exceptions, each of the Minoanized buildings mentioned here was constructed either in the MM3 or early LM1A period, and I'm happy to accept changes to my chronology here, with only 2 examples, Hausae in the northeast Bastion and Irene, continuing in use past the Theran eruption. A much earlier date has recently been proposed, or rather implied, by Marketu for the newly published building at Trianda with the double polytheron and a possible light well, but it's not clear to me on what evidence she assigns it to the Middle Bronze Age or precisely what she means by the Middle Bronze Age. A somewhat earlier date has also been proposed for the Pillar Halls complex at Philakopi, although this date has been questioned by some scholars who prefer to assign it to the LM1A period. Given these observations, then, I wonder, can we see in these Minoanized complexes a physical manifestation of the so-called new environment proposed by Davis and Goriani, a formalized architectural setting in which select participants engaged in a series of social and political rituals associated, at least in part, with the process of acquiring and maintaining a Minoan or Minoanizing identity? And if so, would it be worthwhile or even possible to modify recent applications of network theory in the Neopalatial period and employ not entire sites or islands, but rather these discrete structures and the social groups they represent as nodes? Recent discussions of the phenomenon of acculturation that spread across the Aegean at the transition from the Middle to Late Bronze Age have begun moving in new and exciting directions, away from approaches that treat the concept of Minoanization as a monolithic process, and more towards perspectives that recognize and consider the more nuanced complexities and subtleties that it entailed. The application of new theoretical approaches, notably network and agency theory, together with advances in scientific methodology, in particular macroscopic and microscopic ceramic fabric analysis, have led to the realization that the suite of so-called Minoan cultural traits that characterized this period was much more varied and hybrid in character than previously considered. While Crete may have been the ultimate source and prime inspiration of many, if not most, of the Minoanizing features in this cultural package, it now seems certain that its contents drew as well from other sources throughout the region and incorporated elements that themselves were hybrid in nature. Moreover, it's now recognized that the cultural landscape of Crete itself was no more uniform in character than the suite of Minoanizing traits it inspired. Indeed, recent scholarship increasingly acknowledges the fact that whatever their precise configuration, Crete was populated by a variety of polities whose inhabitants participated in varying degrees and in varying fashions in the dissemination and integration of non-local features, both throughout the wider Aegean world and within the island itself. The work conducted by the members of INSAP at Irene over the past few years, while admittedly preliminary in nature, represents a continuation and expansion of such scholarship, and demonstrates that the gradual and partial incorporation of non-local elements into the local cultural vocabulary was the product of a highly selective and deliberate process undertaken, at least in part, by local communities throughout the Aegean to suit their specific and individual social, economic, and political needs. Moreover, our identification of a second independent establishment of Minoan character, the Northeast Bastion, located some distance from House A, not only strengthens the position of Irene as one of the primary conduits for the reception and transmission of Minoan and Minoanizing cultural traits, but also illustrates the complex and important role such processes played at multiple socio-political levels, most notably amongst the members of a single community. In essence, I feel that it's time to insert a new leaf into the figurative Minoanizing banquet table and allow a more varied and representative range of guests to take their place at this cultural and intellectual feast. Thank you.